Hey there, my name is Alaric Vane. When this story began, I was 12 years old, nothing but skin stretched over bones, rags clinging to my frame, and feet so calloused they no longer felt the sharp stones of the road. I had no home. I had a threadbare sack, a dull knife, and a hunger that lived inside me like a second heartbeat. Greymoor stretched out around me, borderlands where humans and orcs shared the same soil but never they kept to theirs. And I, a half-starved human boy, belonged nowhere. My father had once carried royal blood in his veins, not the kind sung about in taverns. He had walked away from titles, lands, and the stone throne itself to marry my mother, a woman with no name, no dowry, only quiet hands that could mend anything broken. The price was everything. They were stripped of rank and driven. We survived on scraps, repairing saddles for passing caravans, patching wagon wheels, trading labor for a crust of bread. Then the small wars came. Then the fever that rode the winter wind. In 1 year, both my parents were gone. I was left with their silence and the knowledge that somewhere in my blood still flowed the same cursed line that men would kill to erase. Wind clawed through the stubble fields, carrying the smell of damp earth and distant cattle. I had not eaten in 3 days. My legs shook with every step along the dirt track beside the barley fields. I told myself I would simply lie down here, let the cold take me, let the hunger stop gnawing. But then I saw her. She was working alone in the field, sickle flashing. Tall for her age, 14 maybe, shoulders broad from years of labor, skin a deep forest green streaked with mud, black hair tied high, strands escaping to whip across her face. She moved like the wind itself, swift, certain, unstoppable. An orc girl, Mirak. She stopped when she noticed me at the edge of the field. No shout, no raised weapon. She simply looked, long enough that I felt seen, not as vermin, not as a beggar, but as something that might disappear if she blinked. She crossed the distance, boots sinking into the mud, and knelt on the other side of the low wooden fence so our eyes were level. Hers were the color of storm clouds over pine. "You eaten?" she asked. Her voice was rough, direct, like gravel under a cartwheel. I could not answer. My throat had forgotten how. She opened the woven basket at her hip and took out half a round of black barley bread and a wedge of hard cheese, the only meal she would have. Without a word, she passed them through the slats of the fence. I have nothing to give back," I rasped. "I didn't ask," she said. "I ate like an animal." The bread was dense, earthy, still warm from her hands. The cheese was sharp enough to sting my cracked lips. Tears ran down my face and I could not stop them. For the first time since my parents died, someone had looked at me and decided I should live. When the last crumb was gone, she watched me wipe my face. "What's your name?" she asked. "Alaric." She nodded once, as if filing it away. "Mirak." From that day on, she left food for me. Every single day. A corner of bread wrapped in a leaf, a handful of dried berries, a small clay jar of thin porridge. She risked her own meals, her own reputation. I heard the other orcs curse her, feeding the enemy whelp. I saw her friends yank her arm, trying to pull her away. She never stopped. The last day before everything changed, I stood at the fence again, thinner than ever. The words came out before I could swallow them. "Mirak, when I'm rich, I'm going to marry you." She stared at me for a heartbeat, then threw her head back and laughed, a bright, startled sound that cut through the cold air. She thought I was joking, but she reached up, untied the dark red cord that bound her hair, and split it in two. One half she tied. "Keep it," she said, "so you remember what you lived on." That night, I slept under the overhang of a grain shed. Hooves thundered in the dark. A cloaked rider dismounted. Torchlight caught the old royal crest I had not seen since my father's funeral. The man spoke my full name, the one my father had tried to bury. Alaric Vane. Before I could run, hands seized me. They dragged me onto. I twisted in their grip, searching the darkness. Far across the field, Mirak stood motionless among the barley stalks, as if she had felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Our eyes met for one final second. Then the horse wheeled and I was gone. By morning I knew the truth. My father had not simply worked for the crown. He carried the blood of the stone throne. My uncle, Duke Severin, had spent years hunting me, not to kill me, but to protect the last living thread. I left Graymore behind with half a red cord around my wrist and a childish promise no one would ever believe. But I believed it, and that belief would haunt me for the rest of my life. I grew up in Vallebriar, a city of marble spires and iron gates that felt colder than any winter in Graymore. Uncle Severin's estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors who had never known hunger. Every morning he drilled me in ledgers and maps. Every evening he taught me the art of silence, how to listen while others spoke, how to let power settle into your bones without showing it on your face. You carry the blood of kings, he would say, tapping the table with one long finger. Do not let anyone see where you are weak. I learned. I learned to read tax rolls until my eyes burned. I learned to ride with a straight back even when my thighs screamed. I learned to smile at lords who once would have spat on my father's grave. But the only thing I never forgot was the half-red cord hidden beneath my shirt, knotted tight against my skin. When the tutors droned on about alliances, I pressed my thumb to it. When nightmares of my parents' fevered faces woke me, I wrapped my fingers around it. When servants whispered that orcs were little more than beasts, I felt the rough fibers bite into my palm and remembered Mirak's voice. Oh, years slid past like water over stone. At 16, I stood taller, shoulders broadening from sword drills. At 18, I negotiated my first trade contract and watched gold flow into the Vane coffers. At 20, I became the official heir, signing documents that made entire villages bow when I passed. Wealth came easily after that. Land, horses, fine cloaks lined with sable. Women smiled at banquets. Every coin I spent, every field I bought carried the same purpose. I was looking for her. The first time I returned to Graymore, I used a false name and plain clothes. The barley fields had grown wilder. New fences cut the land into tidy squares owned by human merchants. I walked the old track where I had once collapsed. The wooden fence was gone, replaced by stone. No one remembered a girl named... An old orc farmer spat when I asked, and told me the clans had moved north after the last border skirmish. A human tavern keeper laughed and said orc girls all looked the same anyway. I hired men. First one, then 5, then an entire network of discreet agents who rode the northern roads with my gold in their pouches. They brought back rumors and nothing more. A tall orc woman working a forge near Blackpine. A healer in the high passes who none of them matched the girl who had knelt in the mud and fed a starving boy. Year 1, I told myself she had simply moved on. Year 2, I began to fear she had died in one of the endless border feuds. Year 3, I grew angry at the child I had been for making a promise I could not keep. Year 4, I started buying land around Graymore itself, old fallow fields, abandoned mills, stretches of forest no one wanted. I funded wells and bathhouses so no child would ever have to choose between thirst and filth. The nobles in Vallebriar called me soft. The merchants called me mad. I did not care. Every warehouse I built was another reason to ride north, another excuse to walk the same roads and ask the same questions. Year 5, it was a minor gathering. Disputes over winter grain taxes, rights to the common wells, arguments between human farmers and orc herders. My secretary placed the parchment on my desk and waited. I stared at it for a long minute, the red cord warm against my wrist. I will attend, I said. He blinked. My lord, it is beneath your station. Nevertheless. Before we left Vallebriar, I opened the small iron box. Inside lay the half-cord, faded now to the color of dried blood. I tied it around my wrist exactly as Mirak had done all those years ago, knotting it so tightly the fibers cut into my skin. The small pain felt honest. I whispered to the empty room, I'm coming, Mirak. Whether you are alive or only a memory, I need to know. The journey north took 6 days. Each mile felt heavier. When the walls of Graymore finally rose against the gray sky, I told myself I was prepared for disappointment. I told myself 1,000 reasonable things. But deep down, beneath every layer of silk and steel I had wrapped around the boy who once cried over a crust of bread, I still carried the same impossible promise. And I was about to find out if it had survived. The trade hall of Graymore smelled of damp timber, wet wool, and the faint iron tang of old blood from a oil lamp swung low on chains, throwing jagged gold across stone walls that had stood since before my father was born. Every bench was packed, humans in patched cloaks, orcs with braided beards and iron torques, a few dwarves arguing over ale tariffs, even a pair of elves selling herbs in the back row. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the low growl of voice. I took the last seat in the farthest corner, hood still up, the half-red cord hidden beneath my sleeve but burning against my skin like a brand. I had come only to listen. Or so I told myself. My eyes moved from face to face, searching for something I no longer dared name. An old human woman stood first, voice cracking as she spoke of children sleeping under grain sheds. A thick-necked orc merchant rose next, slamming his fist about rising gate taxes that would starve his clan's herds. A dwarf blacksmith shouted over him about blocked trade roads. The arguments rose and fell like waves against rock. I heard none of it. My pulse was louder. Then a woman's voice cut through the noise, calm, low, edged like a well-honed. If you raise the grain tax again, who feeds the orphans sleeping under those same sheds? Who binds the frostbite on the herders who cross the high passes? You speak of coin while children die for lack of bread. The entire hall stilled. I turned so fast my chair scraped stone. She stood 3 rows ahead, cloak simple and dark, black hair bound tight at her nape. Her skin was a deeper forest green than I remembered. Shoulders broader, stance planted like someone who had carried more than her share and refused to set it down. But the eyes, storm gray and unyielding, were the same. And on her left wrist, faded but unmistakable, was the other half of the red cord. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought the sound would echo off the walls. I rose without thinking. The bench legs shrieked. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward like wind through barley. The woman, my Mirak, stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze locked on mine across the crowded hall. For one heartbeat, confusion flickered. Then wariness. Then something sharper, like recognition fighting through years of dust and forgetting. I walked forward between the benches, boots loud on the stone. The room watched in stunned silence. I stopped 3 paces from her, lifted my left arm, and pushed back my sleeve. The half-cord caught the lamplight, dull red against my skin. The color drained from her face, leaving the green almost ashen. Someone in the back muttered, "Vane's heir has lost his mind." I ignored them. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper, yet every ear in the hall strained to hear. "You once gave a starving human boy half your bread in a barley field. Do you remember him?" The silence was absolute. Mirak's eyes dropped to my wrist, then rose slowly to my face. I saw the exact moment memory crashed into her, the slight widening of storm-gray eyes, the sharp inhale, the way her fingers curled at her sides as if reaching for a sickle that was not there. Alaric? The name left her like a breath she had held for 12 years. I nodded once. My throat closed so tightly I could not speak again. She reached up without looking away from me and tugged the red cord free from her own wrist. I lifted my arm. She stepped closer. The cords met, ends brushing, then twisting together as if they had never been apart. A perfect match. The hall exploded. Voices crashed over us. Shouts of disbelief, curses in 2 languages, chairs scraping back. Someone banged a gavel for order and was ignored. I heard my title repeated like a curse. Vane's heir, the royal whelp. He's gone mad over an orc. None of it touched me. Mirak stared at the joined cord, then at me, as if I were a ghost who had learned to bleed. Her voice was barely audible beneath the roar. "I thought you were dead." "I thought the same of you." A heavy hand landed on my shoulder, someone trying to pull me back. Mirak's eyes flashed. She stepped between me and the intruder, voice low and lethal. "Touch him again and you will need more than this hall to stop the bleeding." She caught my sleeve, turned, and led me through the side door behind the speaker's platform, before the crowd could close in. The narrow corridor beyond smelled of herbs and old stone. She pushed open a second door into a small room, lit by a single lantern. Shelves of dried leaves, bandages, and clay jars of salve lined the walls. This was the community clinic she ran. A wooden table held a half-written ledger of families who needed. The noise of the hall became a distant murmur. She faced me fully now, chest rising and falling. Up close I saw the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small scar on her jaw that had not been there before. She was no longer the girl who had knelt in the mud. She was a woman who had survived without me. And still, on her wrist, the red cord now lay joined with mine. "Alaric," she said again. I never stopped looking. Her gaze dropped to the cord once more. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Then we have much to speak of, but not here. Not while the whole border is watching." She was right. Outside, the shouting had not quieted. But for the first time in 12 years, the half-cord around my wrist no longer felt like a memory. It felt like the beginning of The small clinic room smelled of dried lavender and old bandages. A single lantern hissed on the table, casting long shadows across the ledger where Mirak had been writing names of the hungry and the sick. She closed the door behind us with a soft click that somehow felt louder than the shouting still echoing from the hall outside. She turned to face me fully. Her storm-gray eyes moved over my fine cloak, the silver clasp at my throat, the ring. For a long moment she said nothing. Then her voice came, quiet but sharp. "Your royal blood?" I nodded. The words felt heavy after so many years of carrying them alone. "My father walked away from the throne to marry my mother. When they died, my uncle Severin found me. He brought me to Velebriar, raised me as the last heir. I have titles now, land, gold." Mirak's gaze dropped to the joined red cord still wrapped around both our wrists. She touched it once, lightly, as if checking it was real. "So the boy who cried over half a loaf of bread is now the man who could buy the whole field." I flinched. "I didn't come back to buy anything." "No?" She stepped closer. "Then why buy half the land around Greymore? Why open granaries and wells and bathhouses? You think I haven't heard the stories? The great Lord Vane playing savior to the border scum." I swallowed. "I did those things because I remembered a girl who gave me bread when she had nothing. I wanted to become someone who could make sure no child ever had to beg again." She opened it and pushed it across the table toward me. Pages and pages of names. Children, widows, old orc warriors missing limbs, human families burned out of their farms. Next to each name was a careful note. How much grain they needed, how many winters they had left without help. "If you truly want to keep the promise you made as a starving boy," she said, "then help them, not me, them. And don't you dare call it payment for one piece of bread." I stared at the ledger until the names blurred. "I won't," I said. "I swear it." For the next 3 weeks I stayed in Greymore under the excuse of inspecting the new granary. Every morning I rose before dawn and worked beside Mirak. We patched roofs on the clinic. We carried timber to build a larger soup kitchen. We hired both humans and orcs to load wagons, deliberately mixing the crews so they had no choice but to speak to. At night, we sat at the small table in her room, going through the ledger line by line, deciding who needed grain first when the winter stores arrived. The rumors started almost immediately. They say the Vane heir has been bewitched by an orc witch. They say he wants to marry her to steal clan land. They say he's gone soft. I heard them in the market. I heard them in the tavern. I heard them whispered behind my back when I walked the streets. Mirak heard them. She never flinched. But one evening, after we had finished stacking sacks of barley until our hands were raw, she wiped sweat from her brow and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Your promise will kill me if you turn it into a spectacle for the whole border to laugh at." I stopped what I was doing. "I'm not playing." "Then prove it with your hands, not your gold." I did. I worked until my fine cloak was stained. I ate the same thin stew the poorest families ate. I slept on a cot in the corner of the clinic so I could be there when the first frostbite cases arrived at midnight. Then the letter came. It arrived by royal courier at dusk, sealed with the crest of House Vane. The parchment was stiff and cold in my hands. "Alaric, the court requires your presence. Greymore is a distraction. Return at once. The throne does not wait for border games. Severin." I read it twice. Mirak watched me from across the room. She did not ask what it said. She already knew. "You're leaving," she said quietly. I looked up. The joined red cord was still around my wrist. Hers was still around hers. "Not yet," I answered, but we both heard the lie in my voice. She stepped closer until only the ledger stood between us. If you go back to Valabriar without deciding, because the boy who once cried over bread will have become the man who chooses the throne instead. Her words hung in the lantern light, heavier than any tax or title. I closed the letter and met her eyes. Then I need one more night to decide. Mirak did not smile. She only nodded once, the way she had done all those years ago when she handed a starving boy half her bread. One night, she said. And for the first time since I had returned, I was truly afraid I might make the wrong one. The old barley field lay quiet under a thin crescent moon, the stalks whispering like they remembered every footstep I had ever taken here. Wind moved through them, cold and steady, carrying the scent of turned earth and distant smoke from the town. I stood exactly where I had collapsed as a boy. The joined red cord was heavy on my wrist now, both halves knotted together by her hands earlier that evening. She came without sound, the way she always had. One moment the field was empty. The next she was beside me, cloak drawn close against the night chill, black hair loose for once and stirring in the breeze. Neither of us spoke at first. We simply stood. "You're leaving at first light," she said at last. It wasn't a question. "Yes. They will try to keep you in Valabriar. They will offer you titles, brides with pure bloodlines, everything a man of your station is supposed to want." I turned to face her. The lantern light from the distant clinic caught the scar on her jaw and the quiet strength in her storm-gray eyes. "I know." Mirak reached out and took my left hand. Her fingers were rough from years of sickles and bandages. She traced the full circle of red cord now resting against my skin. "You once said you would marry me when you were rich," she murmured. "Do you still say it?" I let out a slow breath. The words I had carried for 12 years felt different now, lighter, truer. I said it when I was a starving boy with nothing to offer but dreams. I won't say it the same way again. I won't marry you to repay a debt for one piece of bread. When I come back, and I will come back, I will ask you properly, as a man who has chosen this place, this life, and you, only if you still want me then. Mirak studied me for a long moment, the wind tugging at her cloak. Then she lifted the joined cord from my wrist, held it between us like a promise made whole, and slipped it back onto my arm herself. She tied the final knot with careful fingers, tight enough that I would feel it every day. "Go," she said softly. "Do what you must in Valabriar. Fight for Greymore from there if you have to. Change the taxes, the laws, the way they look at us. But remember, this cord is no longer half of something lost. It is whole now, and so is the boy who once cried over bread." I closed my hand over hers. "I won't disappear again, Mirak. Not this time." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was enough. Trust, hard. The royal carriage waited at the edge of town, horses stamping, armed escort gleaming in the pale light. The whole market square had turned out to watch. Some bowed, some glared. Orcs stood farther back, arms crossed, faces unreadable. I stepped down from the carriage before anyone could stop me and walked straight to the edge of the barley field where Mirak waited alone. I didn't care who saw. I took her face between my hands, thumbs brushed. "I'm coming back," I said, "for the clinic, for the children, for you, however long it takes." She placed her hand over mine. "Then go, and don't let the gold swallow the boy who once needed half a loaf to survive." I kissed her forehead once, quick, fierce, a promise without words, then turned and climbed into the carriage. The door closed, the wheels began to roll. Mirak stayed exactly where she was, a solitary green figure at the edge of the field, growing smaller, but never vanishing from my sight. Not this time. I touched the full red cord around my wrist and felt the truth settle deep in my bones. Wealth was never the gold in my coffers or the titles on my name. Wealth was this, knowing exactly where I belonged and having the courage to return. And for the first time